A critic said he was finished. Lennon did this live, and the audience started crying. London, February 1971. The Royal Albert Hall. Its magnificent Victorian dome, rising above Kensington like a crown above the city that built it. A building that had witnessed a century of human achievement, human failure, and every complicated, irreducible thing that exists between those two poles. Tonight, it held something that had never quite walked through its doors before. John Lennon, alone. No Beatles. In no Plastic Ono band, no Yoko beside him on stage. Just a man, a guitar, and the specific terrifying weight of having to prove himself to a city that had already read its morning paper. 3 days before John took the stage at the Royal Albert Hall, a review appeared in the Times of London. Not a preview, not an anticipatory profile, a verdict, delivered in advance, with the surgical confidence of a man who had decided that the evidence was already in and the verdict was already written. Now the critic's name was Edmund Hartwell. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, impeccably suited, and possessed of a reputation built across 4 decades of wielding the most dangerous weapon in the cultural arsenal of British life. The authoritative opinion delivered in print before the subject has any opportunity to respond. Hartwell had tolerated the Beatles with the strained, slightly nauseated patience of a man enduring a prolonged social obligation he considers beneath him. Their melodies were occasionally clever, he had written in 1967. Their cultural significance was undeniable. Their claim to serious artistic consideration was, in his view, the most successful piece of marketing in the history of popular entertainment. The breakup had delighted him, not because he wished John Lennon harm, but because it provided what he had always believed would be definitive proof of his position, that the whole had been vastly greater than any of its parts. His piece, unpublished 3 days before the Royal Albert Hall concert, was titled with the economy of someone who considers elaboration a form of weakness. The long silence on the inevitable fading of John Lennon. It was 4,000 words of impeccably constructed demolition. Hartwell traced John's solo output with the careful, clinical attention of a pathologist describing a cause of death. The primal therapy experiments, the raw, unpolished productions, the political statements that Hartwell argued had substituted passion for craft and sincerity for structure, and then, in the final paragraph, the sentence that spread through London's music community like a cold front moving across the Thames. John Lennon, Hartwell had written, is finished. Not spectacularly, not with the dignity of a flame extinguished, but in the manner of a candle that has simply, quietly, run out of wax. The Royal Albert Hall concert will be, I predict with some sadness, not a monument to a man who peaked in collaboration and has spent the years since mistaking confession for art. John Lennon read the piece at 9 o'clock in the morning, 3 days before the concert, in the kitchen of his Ascot home. He read it twice, slowly, without expression. Then he folded the newspaper carefully, set it on the kitchen table, and walked to the piano in the next room. He sat down. He placed his hands on the keys, and he stayed there for 6 hours, playing things that no one heard and that he never recorded. By the time he emerged, something had changed in him. Something had clarified, something that had been living in him as a vague, unresolved pressure had found its shape. He knew what he was going to do at the Royal Albert Hall, not what he was going to play. He had known that for weeks. He knew what he was going to say, before the first note, in the silence before the music, and in the 30 seconds that would determine everything that followed. He was going to tell the truth, not about Hartwell, not in defense of his own career, not with the performer's usual armor of wit and deflection and professional composure. The raw, unprotected, deeply private truth about what it felt like to be told you were finished by a newspaper in front of an entire city, 3 days before you had to walk onto the stage of the Royal Albert Hall and prove otherwise. But what happened next would become one of the most quietly extraordinary nights in the history of that magnificent building. A critic had said he was finished, and John Lennon was about to do something that made an entire audience start crying. To understand what Edmund Hartwell's review meant to John Lennon in February 1971, you have to understand the specific architecture of the wound it opened. John was 30 years old. The Beatles had been legally over for less than a year, although the emotional dissolution had been happening for much longer. He was living in England for what would prove to be the final extended period of his life before he relocated permanently to New York. He was in the middle of processing, through primal therapy, through music, through the relentless, uncomfortable work of genuine self-examination, the accumulated psychological damage of a childhood defined by abandonment. His mother Julia had died when he was 17. Yes, his father Freddie had left when he was 5. He had been raised by his Aunt Mimi, a woman of genuine love and considerable emotional distance. He had built, on the foundation of those early losses, a personality of such carefully constructed toughness that even the people closest to him sometimes couldn't find the soft center beneath the armor. The primal therapy was an attempt to reach that center, to scream it out of hiding, to produce, through the very specific and deeply uncomfortable technique of reliving early childhood pain, a kind of internal honesty that John had been circling for years without quite arriving at. John Lennon's Plastic Ono Band, the album he had released just 2 months before Hartwell's review, was the sonic product of that therapy. It was raw in a way that made some listeners deeply uncomfortable, stripped of melody for its own sake, stripped of the production sophistication that George Martin had brought to the Beatles, stripped of everything, in fact, except the one thing John had decided to stop hiding: his actual feelings. Hartwell had read this stripping as poverty, as the absence of the musical partnership that had previously compensated for John's limitations. He had heard the rawness and called it incompetence. He had heard the vulnerability and called it self-indulgence. This was, and John understood with the clarity of someone who has spent 6 months in primal therapy learning to identify the exact nature and origin of his own pain, precisely the same judgment that had been delivered to him many times before, by teachers who told him he lacked discipline, by industry figures who found his political statements inconvenient, by critics who preferred the palatable Beatles product to the uncomfortable Lennon truth. The review was not new information, but it was delivered at a moment of unusual personal vulnerability, 3 days before a major performance, when John's armor was deliberately thin from months of therapeutic work, and its effect was proportionally more severe. He did not discuss this with anyone. He was not a man who processed pain through conversation, or not easily, not without considerable internal resistance. He processed it through music. Through the 6 hours he spent at the piano the morning he read the review, playing things that had no audience because they were not meant to be performed. They were meant to be felt. By the time he arrived at the Royal Albert Hall, on the evening of the concert, he had made his decision. He carried it with him into the building with the quiet certainty of someone who has resolved a long-standing internal argument and is no longer interested in revisiting it. The audience that filled the Royal Albert Hall that February evening was the most specifically demanding that John had faced as a solo performer. These were not the screaming fans of Beatlemania. These were listeners, people who had read Hartwell's review and come to the concert carrying the verdict in their minds like a measuring stick. Some had come hoping to be proved wrong about the verdict. Others had come prepared to confirm it. A few, scattered through the hall, had come because they loved John Lennon's music with the particular devotion of people who have found in it something that addressed their own private experience with unusual precision. All of them were watching as he walked onto the stage, alone, his guitar hanging at his side, his face carrying an expression that none of them had seen on him before. Not the Beatle charisma, not the political activist's passionate certainty, not the performer's professional warmth. He clearly, remarkably, like a man who was frightened and had decided to be frightened in public rather than hide it. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like that helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. And John Lennon walked to the microphone and stood there. He did not play. He did not speak immediately. He stood with the guitar hanging at his side and looked at the Royal Albert Hall audience with the particular quality of attention that had always made people feel, even in the furthest seats of the largest venues, that he was seeing them specifically. The hall's extraordinary acoustics held the silence with perfect fidelity. Every small sound, every shifted breath, every rustling program, as was audible in the particular way that the Royal Albert Hall makes audible the full texture of human presence. John let the silence be. 10 seconds, 15, 20. The audience, expecting the opening chord, found themselves instead in the unusual position of a room full of people being looked at rather than being shown something. It was uncomfortable. It was strangely intimate. It was unlike anything this building had contained before. Then John spoke. His voice was quiet, and not performing quiet, genuinely quiet. The voice of a man speaking at the volume appropriate to what he was about to say, which was something he had never said in public before, and which the microphone happened to be present for. "I read something in the paper a few days ago," he said. "I expect some of you did too." The hall went very still, because everyone knew exactly what he was referring to. Hartwell's review had been widely read and widely discussed. Its central sentence, the one about the candle running out of wax, had been quoted in 3 subsequent articles. It was the kind of critical verdict that achieves a life of its own, separate from the piece that produced it. "It said I was finished," John continued, his voice still perfectly level. "It said this concert would be a monument to a man who peaked in collaboration." He paused. In the Royal Albert Hall's acoustic perfection, the pause was total. "I've been thinking about that for 3 days," John said, "and I want to tell you what I think about it. Not to argue with it, not to prove it wrong, just to tell you what I actually think, which is something I try to do when I can, even when it's not particularly comfortable." He looked down at the guitar in his hands for a moment, then back up. "I think he might be right." The sound that moved through the audience at this admission was not shock. It was something more complex. It's the sound of 2,000 people simultaneously recalibrating their understanding of what was happening on this stage. "I think it's possible," John continued, his voice carrying a quality of genuine, unperformed reflection, "that my best work happened in collaboration, that the 4 of us together made something that none of us can make alone. I think about that a lot, in the middle of the night mostly, the way you think about things that don't have comfortable answers. He sat down on the edge of the stage, the familiar gesture of lowering himself to the level of the people watching, his legs dangling over the edge, his guitar across his lap. "What I can't agree with," he said, "is the idea that finishing is the same as being finished. That the end of one thing is the end of everything. That a man who can't make what he used to make has nothing left to offer." He looked at his hands, then at the audience. "Because here's what I know. I know that everything I make now comes from a place that the other stuff never reached. It's not better. I'm not saying it's better, but it's real in a different way. It's closer to the actual thing, to what's actually in there." He placed one hand flat against his chest. The gesture was so simple and so untheatrical that it was, for that precise reason, completely devastating. "And I figure," John said, his voice dropping even quieter, "yeah, that even if nobody else thinks that's worth anything, it's worth something to me. And that might have to be enough." The Royal Albert Hall was absolutely silent. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the hall, a sound began. Not applause, something quieter. Someone was crying. And then someone else. And then, in the way that genuine emotion moves through a room of people who have been brought to the edge of their own private truths by someone else's honesty, the sound spread. Not loud, not theatrical, the quiet, involuntary crying of people who have just heard someone say something true that they recognize from inside their own experience. John sat on the edge of the stage and let them cry. He did not play. He did not reach for humor. He simply waited, with the patience of someone who understands that there are moments when the right thing to do is to let the room feel what it needs to feel. After several minutes of that extraordinary, deer-inhabited silence, broken only by the quiet sound of people crying throughout the hall, John picked up his guitar. He did not announce what he was going to play. He simply began. The opening notes of Mother filled the Royal Albert Hall with a sound that had no softness in it, no technical polish, no concession to the expectations of a prestigious venue or a demanding audience. It was the sound of something completely stripped, not as if every layer of protection and professionalism and performance had been removed, and what remained was simply the acoustic evidence of one human being's specific, undefended experience. And then he sang. What the audience witnessed over the next 45 minutes was not a concert in any conventional sense. It was closer to what would happen if the process of primal therapy was somehow made audible. If the work of reaching the soft, undamaged center beneath the armor could be performed in real time, in front of 2,000 witnesses, with perfect fidelity to whatever was actually there. Song after song, John played with an honesty so absolute that several musicians who were present that night later said they had never heard anything quite like it in a live performance. Not because of technical virtuosity, in fact, the opposite, and because of the complete absence of the usual technical apparatus that performers deploy to manage the distance between themselves and their audience. There was no distance. That was what made it unbearable and beautiful in equal measure. He played God, the song in which he systematically disavowed every belief and identity and collective myth that people had attached to him, ending with the quiet, devastating declaration that the dream was over. In the Royal Albert Hall, not 3 days after being told he was finished, the song carried a weight that its studio recording, extraordinary as it was, had not quite achieved. He played Isolation, the song about the specific loneliness of being famous and frightened simultaneously. about the gap between the public figure and the private person that fame creates and widens every year. In the context of the evening, in the context of the speech he had given before the music began, the song was not a performance, and it was a report. Between songs, he did not speak much. When he did, it was in the same quiet, undefended register as his opening remarks. He mentioned his mother once, briefly, before playing Mother. He said simply, "She died when I was 17. I've been trying to finish this song ever since." The audience, which had begun crying during his opening remarks and had not entirely stopped, found itself in an emotional territory for which the usual responses were inadequate. Applause felt insufficient. Silence felt insufficient. What was happening on stage was too intimate, too specific, too genuinely felt for the conventional responses of a concert audience to address. So they did something that audiences at the Royal Albert Hall rarely do. They sat with the discomfort of not knowing exactly how to respond, and allowed that discomfort to be present in the room alongside the music. In the fourth row, a young woman named Catherine Ellis, who had come to the concert as a music student and would later become a therapist working with musicians, described the experience years later. "I had been to hundreds of concerts by that point," she said. "I understood music technically and emotionally, but I had never sat in a room where the performer had removed every available piece of protection and was simply singing from whatever was actually there. And it was simultaneously the most courageous and most frightening thing I had ever witnessed someone do on a stage." She paused. "I cried for most of it, not because it was sad, though it was, but because it was true. And truth, delivered without armor, in a room with 2,000 other people, is one of the most powerful things a human being can experience." The concert reached its final third. John had been playing for nearly an hour. The audience had moved through shock, then grief, and then something that didn't have a comfortable name, a kind of profound collective presence, the specific quality of attention that a room achieves when every person in it has stopped thinking about anything except what is happening right now. John looked out at the hall. His face, in the stage lights, carried the particular quality of someone who is tired in the way that real honesty makes you tired. Not depleted, truthful. The tiredness of having said what you actually meant. He spoke one more time before the final song. "I want to say something about Edmund Hartwell," he said. The hall, already quiet, became quieter. "Not to argue with his review," John continued. "I think I said what I think about that at the beginning, but I want to say something else." He looked down at his guitar for a moment, running his thumb along the strings without sounding them. "Criticism is a form of caring," he said. "When it's honest, even when it's wrong, even when it's cruel, even when it chooses the most devastating possible way to say the thing it's trying to say. At the bottom of it, if it's genuine, it comes from someone who cares enough about the art to be angry that it's not what they believe it should be." He looked up. "I think Edmund Hartwell cares about music. I think he cares so much about what music can be at its best that the distance between that ideal and what I've been making genuinely bothers him. And I respect that. I don't agree with his conclusions, but I respect the passion underneath them." The hall was absolutely motionless. "What I want to do," John said, his voice dropping to its quietest register yet, "is play him one more song, whether he's here tonight or not, whether he ever hears it or not, because the best answer to someone who says you're finished is not an argument." He placed his hands on his guitar. "Yes, it's a song." He began to play Imagine. What happened in the Royal Albert Hall during that performance of Imagine has been described, in the years since, in terms that music criticism doesn't quite have the vocabulary to capture. The combination of everything that had preceded it, the speech before the music, the hour of undefended honesty, the specific vulnerability of a man who had read his own artistic obituary in a newspaper and chosen to respond by removing the last available piece of armor and singing anyway. The melody, usually carried by piano in its recorded form, translated to guitar with an intimacy that the piano arrangement, for all its beauty, does not achieve. It sounded in the Royal Albert Hall that February night less like an anthem and more like a conversation. I was singing with him. Not in the third verse, the audience was singing with him. Not in the organized, unified way of a crowd that has been directed toward participation. In the spontaneous, fragile way of people who have been so moved by something that singing is the only adequate response. The Royal Albert Hall's legendary acoustics and are designed to carry the softest sound to the furthest seat, carried the sound of 2,000 people singing quietly together with perfect fidelity to every corner of the building. And in that sound, in that particular quality of collective human voice, singing a song about a world that doesn't yet exist but deserves to, the evening reached its extraordinary, unexpected conclusion. Not a triumph in the conventional sense, not a definitive refutation of Hartwell's verdict, and something more complicated and more lasting than either of those things. The sound of a room full of people who had come prepared to measure a man against a verdict, and had instead been invited into the experience of being human alongside him, and had found, in that invitation, something they hadn't known they were looking for when they walked through the doors. Edmund Hartwell attended the concert. This fact, which emerged gradually in the weeks following the Royal Albert Hall performance, through the accounts of people who recognized him in the audience, became perhaps the most discussed detail of the entire evening. He had not announced his attendance. He had not sought a press pass or a special seat. He had purchased a ticket through ordinary channels and sat in the fifth row, center section, throughout the entire performance. He did not publish a follow-up review. Not immediately. And not for 3 weeks. When the follow-up finally appeared, it ran longer than the original piece, 4 times longer, and it was unlike anything Edmund Hartwell had published in 4 decades of music criticism. It began with a sentence that was quoted in every subsequent account of the Royal Albert Hall evening. I was wrong. Not about everything, but about the most important thing. Hartwell described the opening speech in precise detail. He quoted John's words about the candle running out of wax. He noted with the careful honesty of a man who has decided that accuracy matters more than self-protection, that hearing his own metaphor quoted back to him from the stage of the Royal Albert Hall had produced in him a physical sensation he described as the feeling of having said something in a room you thought was empty and discovering it was full. He wrote about the music. He was precise and unsparing in his analysis. He maintained that his technical criticisms were not unfounded, that the productions were sparse where they might have been rich, that the melodies sometimes served confession at the expense of craft. And then he wrote the paragraph that people remembered. What I failed to account for in constructing my verdict 3 days before this concert was the possibility that confession and craft might not always be required to exist in the same proportion. That there are moments in an artist's development when the urgency of the thing being said outweighs the elegance of its saying. That rawness, deployed with sufficient honesty and sufficient courage, achieves something that polish, however accomplished, cannot. He concluded with a sentence that he reportedly revised 17 times before settling on its final form. John Lennon is not finished. He is, perhaps for the first time, ungenuinely begun. The review was read and reread across London's cultural community. It generated more correspondence than anything the Times Arts section had published in years. Musicians wrote, other critics wrote, ordinary readers who had attended the Royal Albert Hall or who had heard about it from people who had, wrote. John Lennon himself wrote a single handwritten note delivered to Hartwell's office at the Times that contained 4 words. Thank you. You keep listening. Hartwell kept the note for the rest of his life. For John, the Royal Albert Hall evening left a residue that was difficult to name precisely. He spoke of it rarely in interviews, and when he did, obliquely. But those who knew him well in the period that followed described a subtle but real shift in his approach to performance and to the relationship between his public and private self. The act of saying the true thing in public, and of refusing the armor in front of 2,000 people who had come with a verdict already in their hands. Of responding to being told he was finished not with defiance, but with the quieter, more difficult courage of radical honesty. Something in that act had settled something in him that had been unsettled for a very long time. New York City, December 8, 1980. John Lennon was murdered. In the days that followed, the world produced the accounts of who he had been. The official narratives is the Beatle mythology, the political activist, the peace campaigner, the difficult man, the loving father, the complicated genius. And the quieter stories, the ones that lived in the memories of the people who were there for the specific private moments that the cameras didn't capture and the history books don't quite hold. The Royal Albert Hall, February 1971. The speech before the music. The 30 seconds of silence before he said the first word. The admission that the critic might be right. The quiet, devastating hand pressed flat against his chest. The audience beginning to cry before the first song was played. Catherine Ellis, the music student who had been in the 4th row, became a therapist. She worked for 30 years with musicians who were struggling with the gap between their public image and their private experience. The Royal Albert Hall concert was something she described to clients, not as a lesson or an instruction, but as an example. What John Lennon did that night, she said, in a late career interview, was demonstrate something that most performers spend their entire lives trying to avoid: the complete removal of the protective distance between what you are and what you show. She paused. And what happened when he did that was not what most people fear will happen. The audience didn't turn away. They didn't find it embarrassing or excessive or self-indulgent, which is what performers usually imagine. They started crying. Because they recognized it. Because every person in that hall had their own version of being told they were finished, their own version of reading the verdict, their own version of the candle running out of wax. And John Lennon stood on the stage of the Royal Albert Hall and said, "I read that too, and here's what I think about it." And then he played them the most honest music he had ever played in public. And in doing that, why, he gave every person in that room permission to feel their own version of the same thing, to stop pretending they hadn't read their own verdict in whatever form it had taken, to acknowledge that they were frightened and diminished and uncertain and still here. Still here. That's the thing. He was still here, and he was making something. And whether it was better or worse than what came before was for that one extraordinary evening, entirely beside the point. The Royal Albert Hall still stands. Its Victorian dome still rises above Kensington. Its acoustics still carry the softest sound to the furthest seat with the fidelity of something built to honor the human voice. Somewhere in its acoustic memory, in the way that great spaces hold the residue of the most extraordinary things that have occurred within them. There is the echo of a February evening in 1971. A man walking onto a stage alone. Not the Beatle, or not the activist, not the performer, just a man who had read in the paper that he was finished, and who had decided, with the specific, costly, quietly revolutionary courage of someone who has run out of armor, to respond to that verdict not with argument, with the truth, and then with a song. And the audience, 2,000 people, who had come with a measuring stick and left with something they hadn't known they needed, had cried. Not for him, not entirely, for themselves, for their own verdicts, for their own candles, for the thing in themselves that recognized without needing to be told what it feels like to be told you are finished, and to keep singing anyway. The Times of London archive holds both reviews, the verdict and its revision, 3 weeks apart. What the archive doesn't hold is the sound of 2,000 people crying before the first song began. It doesn't hold the 30 seconds of silence, the hand pressed flat against the chest, or the 4 words sent to a critic's office. Thank you. Keep listening. Those things live somewhere else, in the people who were there, and in anyone who has ever read their own verdict and walked onto the stage anyway. The end. If this story about the radical courage of honesty, the power of refusing to defend yourself against a truth you already know, and the extraordinary grace of responding to a verdict not with argument but with a song moved you, subscribe and leave that powerful like below. Share this with someone who needs to hear that being told you are finished is not the same as being finished. What moment in your life taught you the difference between those two things? Tell us in the comments below.